Hey everybody, Hunter back again from Showtime Studios. We're moving on to part number 10 of the build tutorial. In the last one, we were working on some of the front suspension components. And what I did is I went ahead and what we didn't do on camera, I finished up off the camera. And we'll hold it up here and just let you get a rough view of what we have going on. I'm going to get it so hopefully it focuses in here. There we go. That's the front suspension components into place and looking pretty good for the most part. There's the spindle and everything, and you can see the airbag in there in between the control arms. So I went ahead and got that glued up. The one thing that I did do in here that I want to make mention of right off the bat in this video is the spindle. What I look for is I will hold the chassis like right now I'm looking at, well, you're kind of looking at almost the same view I am. And like on the cross member right down here, I am trying to make sure that the spindle is lined up even with that cross member as far as level. And then I will take the chassis and I will look down on it and make sure that the spindle is lined up with the cross member going this way. And that way you don't have a lot of issue with a toe problem or a camber problem on a non-posable steering. And you put just a little bit of glue where the ball joints would be, and that way, as you're working on other things, you can just kind of keep a check on this, check it that way, and then it'll set up. And if you need to make any further adjustments when we get ready to put the wheels and tires on, I'll show you a little trick to doing that. So that's that part. We went ahead and put that side together. I've went ahead and cleaned up all the mold lines and everything and all the components laying here. This is the rest of for this side of the suspension. And the only other piece that we need to clean up and get installed after that is going to be the rack and pinion. And we'll get to that in probably the next episode. But this one here, we're going to go ahead and glue these parts that we already have cleaned up to the model, which will complete the right side suspension. And one other thing that I've done is the way this model is made, there is a notch in the right here where the upper control arm goes in. And the upper control arm actually does not fill that notch totally in when you glue it into place. So what I did is after I got it glued in there and I got the suspension all set and the spindle, pretty much in the neighborhood of where it needed to go and the shock put on, I went ahead and put just a little bit of filler right back in here to fill in that extra area that the little pin didn't take up. So we'll let all that dry up, we'll sand that out, and it'll look like, it'll be nice and smooth and look decent. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next assembly steps on this. And we're going to be using, of course, the Tamiya extra thin cement. And I'm going to start out with installing the airbag. And remember in the part 9, the last episode, was made reference to lining up where the mold line was on the airbag so that it's going this way on the model. So we're going to go ahead and slide the airbag up into place. And we're just going to try to twist that to get it lined up there. Okay, the airbag is up into place. Now we're going to take a little bit of the extra thin and put on it. There we go. And we're just going to push that up into place and make sure that it seats in there real good. You really want to pay close attention to your suspension components and make sure that you've got everything kind of going even side to side, because it'll make a big difference in how the model sits when you're done. So the next thing that we're going to do is the other lower control arm. And like I say, I've already cleaned up. This is the chrome control arm, and I've already cleaned up my glue attachment points here. So we're going to flip the chassis over. And we're going to set the control arm into place. We're going to line it up on the airbag. There's a hole in the lower control arm where it lines up on the airbag. And then we're going to get it somewhat centered up in there. This one wants to flop around a little bit. We'll fix that problem. I'll show you how to take care of that. We're going to take a little bit of the extra thin. We're going to drop down in this control arm hole here where the airbag mount is. And then we're going to take a little bit more and put across the cross member where the control arm shaft mounts. And in the last video, I made a reference that things didn't look right on this. What AMT has done with this kit is they're actually doing, they're replicating the suspension being in the dropped position. And that's why the upper control arms and the lower control arms are all facing uphill. And it looks kind of strange, but what it is actually the airbags are what we were called dumped, and the airbags, all the air's out of them, so the car is dropped at its lowest ride height. So that's why it looks kind of goofy. If it was going down the road and the suspension looked like that, you would have some serious issues. And believe it or not, being in an alignment tech for a lot of years, I have seen many of suspensions that kind of look like some of these models, and you got to scratch your head going, who thought that up? I've actually turned stuff away that people brought in because they wanted me to do miracles on it. And I'm like, what you need is a new suspension. You don't need an alignment. And it's some of the stuff that I've seen hacked up on one-to-one cars in the front suspension was crazy over the years. But that's why I made that reference to it. Something didn't look right. And I noticed that the control arms were going uphill. I mean, like way uphill. And the way the rack and pinion goes in this, you would have serious bump steer problems. So that's just something us guys that's, been in the one-to-one stuff look at and we pay attention to. I don't know why we do that, but we do. So what I'm doing now is just seating the lower control arm into place. I'm trying to match up the left side, make sure everything is even across this way. And we'll hold it up here and let you see it. We're trying to make sure that everything's square, straight across, same angles and everything on the control arms. So we've got the lower glued into place now. Now we're going to move on to the upper control arm. And I've got all the mold lines cleaned up on it. The chrome stripped off the attachment point there. And we're going to put a little spot of glue right here in this notch on the frame. And I'm going to put a little spot of glue on the underside of the control arm here, on the control arm shaft. And like I say, when you're using this Tamiya extra thin, be very careful where your fingers are, because if you grab this part with that adhesive on there, it will leave your fingerprint embedded into the actual plastic. So be very careful where your fingers are when you're using these liquid adhesives, because they do tend to move around and get in places, and you grab a hold of it and go, uh-oh, I got glue all over my fingers. Well, that's not the big issue. The big issue is you now have your fingerprint as part of the model, so then you got to go back in and sand it out. And trust me, I do it on every build. I'll have that glue sneak around the corner while I'm holding the part into place and get underneath of my finger. And when you let go of the part, it's like, oh, there's my fingerprint. And this front suspension, I will tell you, is very fiddly, the way that they designed it. So you may have to kind of, if you're building this particular model, you're going to have to play with it a little bit, shift some things around, hold things here and there. It's a little tricky how they do it, but it all goes together pretty well. Now, another thing is I was doing a review of the part 9. I kind of do a proof of all my videos before I upload them. And I did notice that this thing kind of looks clunky and it doesn't look like one of my typical builds. And that is true. As you know, we're doing this thing box stock. We're putting it together with what comes in the box. It is an AMT kit. They are not the most highly detailed, the most well-made kits out there. Nothing against AMT. They give you a lot of options as far as build subjects. Uh, and that's why on my models, even if it's an AMT kit, if I'm doing a full competition model, you will look at that model and a lot of times not believe it's an AMT kit. It's because I throw some of these parts away, scratch build other parts, modify parts. I make things, look a lot more realistic than what they give you in the kit. But in the case of this tutorial and this build here, we're doing it with what they give you in the kit and making a couple modifications, but nothing major. So I just wanted to say that before somebody looks at some of this clunkiness that's in this thing and go, man, I thought he was better than that. I'm kind of working with what they gave me here. And we're just, like I say, doing this for the younger guys, the beginners, and people that don't have a lot of experience in the hobby, and showing them, you know, as easy as we can what steps to go through to build a model. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to attempt, and I had trouble on the other side with this, I'm going to attempt to slide the spindle down in here and not knock everything of the front suspension off while I get this seated. And like I say, on the driver's side, I had a little bit of an issue, but I learned something as I was working on that side. So, yeah, there we go. That went a lot smoother than the driver's side did. Experience pays off sometimes. And that's another thing to remember. I mean, when you're working on a model, you know, if you do one side and it gives you a little bit of trouble and it's kind of hard to get together, um, you know, the next side usually goes a little bit better for you, because you've already done it once, so you know what's going to move around, where your problem areas are. So it gets a little bit easier on this, what I call the second side. So what I'm doing now is just sliding the upper control arm around a little bit so I can get my spindles that we were talking about. I'm trying to get the spindles to be even across this way here. And that way, when we get ready to put our wheels and tires on, everything is about as true as we'll be able to get it. All right, that's looking pretty good from the front. And then you just want to check your side across this way and make sure that they're going straight with the cross member. And like I say, I don't use any jigs or anything when I'm doing kit parts like this. Now, when I'm scratch building my front suspensions, like I did on the VW Beetle and on the 112 scale Camaro that I was working on, that I need to get done one of these days, I will use a homemade jig. I use an individual jig for each build. And I'm also using what I call a build table. It's just like a frame jig that, we use when we build one-to-one race cars. I kind of bring that same design over into model building. But when I'm doing kit parts like this, I don't use any jigs. Or sometimes what I'll do, and I'll show you in a later step when we put the wheels and tires on, I'll take like 2 bottles of Tamiya cement or 2 paint bottles or something like that. And I will set the tires up against those bottles because that my workbench is level. This bottle is, plumb up and down, so I can set the bottle right against the tire and just shift everything and make sure we've got it all lined up straight up and down and get the toe and everything right. But we'll show you that step when we get to that stage. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer. All right, so I now have all of the main front suspension components into place. And looking pretty decent. It's a little clunky for me, but hey, it'll work once we get everything sanded, get everything primed, painted, do some detail work here and there with painting and washes and stuff like that. We'll be good. So The next thing that I need to put in place, and this was a little bit tricky too, as soon as I find it, I don't know what I did with it. There it is, was the shock. And the shock, actually, it's a street rod style where it mounts to the back of the upper control arm shaft and then the center of the lower control arm. And I got to check and see if this side is the same as the driver's side. Nope, this side's a little bit better. I'm surprised. I actually had to drill out the little eyelet in the driver's side to fit over top of the pins on the control arm. But this side here slipped right into place, believe it or not. And now that we got it in place, I'm going to take a little bit of the Tamiya Extra Thin, drop a little bit on each pin. And then let me get my scriber here. I'm going to push that shock, seat it all the way back against the control arm. And then I'll come in with just a little dab of Extra Thin and put on the shock eyes where it would actually be the bolt. Now that's another thing like on this model, I'm not going to do it, but typically what I would do on one of my builds is there would be some sort of a nut on the end of the control arm shafts. I would actually sand that down, make that a flush surface, and put a tiki train bolt in there, an actual hex bolt with the washer on the top and the bottom, and it just gives you that little bit of added detail, makes the model pop. But when you're doing box stock, you can't really do that because you're adding components. So there's the front suspension into place. And like I say, just keep a check on your spindles from time to time. Hold it up, look at it, make sure it's good this way. Hold it this way, make sure that they go straight across, and let the glue dry on them, and you'll be good to go. Now, something else I've got laying here that we're going to go ahead and put in place real quick before we do the rack and pinion is the top of the fuel tank. And that's the piece that I had a sink mark in that we put the Tamiya putty in. I got it all sanded down. It's ready to go in place. It's a piece that when the model's assembled, you don't even see it because the back of the body covers it up. But we're going to put it in place anyway. But what I'm going to do on this is I'm actually going to move on to the little bit thicker Tamiya cement. And I will show you why I'm using that on this one. This glues in. It's got little tabs right here that slide right down on the inside of the lower part of the fuel tank. So I'm just going to dab a little bit of glue on those pins. And I'm not actually going to put any glue on the flange of the fuel tank. I'm just going to glue the little pins for now. And the reason why I do that is that way I don't have any glue that's squeezing out at my joint at the flange where the top and the bottom meet. I can go ahead and just glue those pins. I can set this down into place and move it around a little bit, get it squared up, get it the way that I want it. And when you look at it from underneath, you can see the white part all the way around. Camera, where are you at? There you are. You can see that there's a white part all the way around that primered part. And I didn't put the glue on the bottom because if you put this into place and you slide it around a little bit, it messes up that flange. And then you've got glue all over the flange, and you don't want that. So we just glued the pins, and I've got it in place, got it all nice and even now. So now what I'll do is come back in with the Tamiya Extra Thin. And from underneath, I will go ahead and just drag a bead of that right straight across. And same thing on the back, right straight across. And we'll let that draw into the joint. And it's a nice clean line. You don't see any glue squeeze out or anything like that. So that takes care of that part. That's just a little part I had laying here. That's actually in the next step on the instructions. We are working on step number 3 here. And other than putting the rack and pinion in, getting it cleaned up, put it in, we've got everything else done. Now, they want the rotors to go on at this point, and they also want the wheels and tires for the front to go on. We are not going to put the wheels and tires on yet. And even for the beginning guys out there, follow along with the rest of the series. And I'll show you why I do not put wheels and tires on yet. And most of the time, I don't put the rotors on yet. So stay tuned. That part will be coming up. But we're going to put the rack and pinion in, and we'll have the main components on except for the rotors and the wheels and tires. But that fuel tank thing that I was talking about comes up in the next step of the frame assembly. And that's this piece right here. And that's when we start putting in the radiator, supposedly putting the engine in, but we're not going to do that either, and the exhaust and all that stuff. But we'll get there in an upcoming episode. Okay, so we're going to set this over to the side right now. We're going to let that dry a little bit while we're working on the next piece. And that is part number 23, which is the rack and pinion and the steering shaft. And this is another one of them excess pieces of plastic sticking out here from the molding process. We cut that off. And then out here on the ends of the tie rod ends, you have the same thing. So we're going to snip those off. And while I'm using these Tamiya cutters that I rant and rave about, and always use them, there is some guys out there that will use a hobby knife to cut parts off the tree. I know Mr. Don Yost does it, and he has real good luck doing it that way. He recommends doing it that way. Actually, if you ask my recommendation, I'm going to say use a pair of good snippers, like these Tamiya snippers that I got for Christmas. They are very handy, very nice pieces, but it's whatever works best for you. I made reference to using the number 11 blade as a seam scraper, and I also said that there was an actual tool, seam scraper that they make and they offer. And one of my viewers that watched the video actually went ahead and ordered one of them because he doesn't have any luck doing mold lines or seams with a number 11 blade or sandpaper. So he's going to try out the seam scraper and see if that works better for him. So, you've always got options out there. So, just because I show one way to do it, or, somebody like Don Yost shows one way to do it, or, anybody else out there in the community, it's great to have multiple ways of, watching people do things, and, give them a try, see if they work for you. But if it's something that doesn't work for you, keep looking, keep practicing, keep, and find your own niche and your own way to do things. And, I know there's a lot of guys, and I'm just like that. I will take a little bit of a technique that one person does and a little bit of a technique that another person does. And then I will do a little bit of my own technique mixed with those two. And that's, how I build my models. I've made reference to having mentors out there in the hobby. And yes, I do. And I've talked to those guys at shows. I've competed with them. And they show me, I ask them, how did you do that? And they'll tell me. And then I'll see, one of my other mentors either at the same show or an upcoming show. And I'll ask him, how did you do that? And it's a totally different procedure than what the first person told me. So I'll take all that information and I'll bring it home to the hobby room, and I'll sit down and I'll try it both ways. And sometimes, those ways just don't work for the individual. But I'll take, and I'll remember that finished product that was sitting on the table from those guys and go, well, let's see if I can, copy that. And I just kind of put my own thing together and come up with my own way to do it. So by no means is anything that I'm doing here on video, set in stone and the only way to do it. That's, nobody has an only way to do something in this hobby. Remember that you need to, get enough experience where you find your own way to do it. And I put these videos out there to give people another option. They don't have to do it that way. Hell, a lot of times it's probably better that some of my techniques that I use you don't do, because they get me in trouble sometimes. But I have my reasons for doing that. And you know, it is what it is. I still have fun doing it for the most part. Sometimes it gets aggravating, but usually when it gets aggravating, I just walk away from it and I don't do anything that has to do with modeling or competing or even looking at a model. Okay, we're doing now is just cleaning up the mold lines on this rack and pinion. Now there is rubber boots that's on a rack that are normally black, and actually AMT did cast them in here very well in this part. And those boots that I'm referring to are right here and right here. They're the little ribbed sections that's on there. Now the only bad thing about this type of detail is there is a mold line that runs right through the ribbed boots. And that is one of those areas that on my, full out competition builds, I usually will scratch build these boots and I will cast them in resin. And that way I have pretty much what I refer to as a perfect part. And what I mean by that is a part that doesn't have any mold lines in it. It doesn't have any cleanup. It's basically, I can take it right out of the mold and slide it into the rack, and it's a finished product other than primer and paint. But when you have these kit parts and you have to try to clean up the mold lines through the rib detail, you one of two things is going to happen. You're going to lose all of the rib detail where the mold line is, or you're going to get most of the mold line out, but not all of it. So at the competitions, I watch people that if they attempted to clean up this area, then I don't dock them as far as points or missed basics. But if that's a flat out mold line that goes all the way across there and it was not addressed at all, then I look at that as a missed modeling basic. So, but that's one of the hurdles that you have when you're messing with just straight kit parts and not doing any modification, not doing any scratch building. Doing a box stock model, you don't really change any of that stuff. Okay, I'm looking here to see if I've got everything cleaned up the way I want it. It's looking pretty decent. And another thing I'd like to, just kind of put out there right now is I'm doing this series. I'm showing you techniques and stuff. But I will be the first to tell you that I am not putting 100% into this build. That's not what I set out to do. I set out to do a series for the, younger modelers, the beginning modelers that I've made reference to many times in this series. And, this model will come out okay, but it's not going to be one of those wow factor models. That's not what I set out to do in this series. And I want everybody to understand that and, know that I'm not trying to build a competition winning model here. If I put it into competition and it, places, hey, I'm a happy camper. So what I'm doing now is just dry fitting some things just to make sure that everything is going into place the way we want it to. And I see now that I have to enlarge the tie rod ends just a little bit. And this is a tool that we haven't talked about yet in this series. This is a pin vise. All you seasoned guys know what it is. You can get multiple, drill bit sets for these. They're very handy. It's something that, as far as modeling, when you get a little bit more into it, it's a component that you definitely are going to have. So, but I didn't add it to the initial list because right off the bat, I don't really think you need it. You can do the same thing that I'm doing by sticking the hobby knife in here and spinning it very lightly. You can enlarge just about any hole that you're working with on a model that way until you get up to the point of needing a pin vise or wanting to invest in one. So right off the bat, I'm not going to say you have to have one. It's a nice addition, but not 100% necessary. Okay, and this whole thing here is a little bit tedious, so I'm trying to make sure that I'm catching all of the bad areas in this rack. It's actually a pretty good rendition of a rack and pinion, but it does have a lot of parts that need to be cleaned up on it here. So here we are, sanding and scraping again. Man, it seems like we do a lot of that. Huh. Yeah, we do a lot of that. It doesn't seem like it. And like I say, this front suspension is very fiddly. You just kind of have to work with everything and figure out a way to hold things and not knock something else out. I mean, it's a little tricky. I will say that, but we'll definitely get her into place here. I don't want to know what all we're going to knock out of place doing it, but we'll get it in there where we want it. Sometimes you just have to keep working at these things, and it'll finally snap into position and do exactly what you want it to do. Okay, now we have the rack and pinion installed. And I get the chassis over here in the, come on camera, there we go. The rack and pinion is installed. So now we're going to get ready to glue the joints up. And as far as the front suspension, after we glue this up, it is complete. So there is another step gone. And the way that this rack mounts to the frame is kind of crude. It's not very accurate at all, but it is what it is. Tell you the truth, I'm actually having a lot of fun doing these tutorials. I didn't think I would be able to do it, but so far it looks like it's coming out, and we're going to continue to move along with it. And it's been an enjoyable process so far, especially with you guys coming in and really watching all the videos and really supporting the series. Now, of course, I just knocked this thing loose again. There we go. Now we got it back in there. And that's another thing, when you put another component in, make sure that these spindles are still going straight across, and check it at the front. Make sure you're still going straight across this way. But there you go. That's all the front suspension installed in the little street rod. That's what it looks like from the top. And there's the bottom. So that completes step number 3 on the instructions, except for the brakes and the front tires. So when we come back in the next episode, we are going to start on the next step, which is we're going to be putting the radiator together. We'll be putting the battery tray together, the air tank and the air pump, that kind of stuff will be going in. And then we will be skipping a couple of things, so I'll explain that as we go along. And then we're going to get into putting the rear end in. And if you remember, we put the rear end together on camera, and I went ahead and cleaned everything up and got that in a coat of primer. So that's ready to go. We got the 4-link bars that have to go in yet, the rear shocks, the rear airbags. So that's all coming up in the next episode. So stay tuned for that. If you have any questions or concerns on what we've done so far, leave me a comment or a question on the video. Be more than glad to answer them as we work along here on this. And as always, I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.